Canto 4. When Cal awoke again, they were no longer in the house. It was still green and beautiful, but there was a weight to the air that wasn't there before. Stretching, he muttered, "Seriously, I have no idea what's going on." He was currently okay if the whole thing turned out to be a strange dream, which was his working theory at the moment. Sophie, who had been comfortably lying beside him on the grassy knoll, sat up. "Good morning, sunshine. Sleep well?" "What happened?" Cal asked. "You took hold of the golden bough of Aeneas. It was used on a former Charon to bribe a way into hell. It's been passed on through the centuries for people like you. It causes you to go into a deep death-like state, so that you can get here." While she talked, Cal noticed Sophie had gone physically pale. "Are you afraid to be here?" he asked, sure that he didn't want to know the answer. Briefly frowning, Sophie responded, "Do I look afraid?" She shook her head. "That's not fear. This place always fills me with sadness. So many lost souls." He was fairly sure that what he was seeing was fear, but he didn't want to push it. After all, what did he know about this woman? She was a soul collector. She was married to a guy who transported souls to hell. As crazy as both those things were, they were hardly enough to know if how she looked was sadness or fear. Then he realized something. That branch in Charon. "That was a story I read by Virgil," Sophie completed. "Not very many breathers get to visit this place, so we talk about the few who do." "Dante!" Cal shouted, realizing why he knew about the branch. It was because he had read through the Cliff Notes version of the Divine Comedy. He actually came here? This fortified his dream theory. This was all a book, no more real than the White Rabbit or the Queen of Hearts. This was no more real than Scrooge's piece of undigested beef. "Is Dante here?" Standing, Sophie brushed herself off. "No, he's not, but from what I heard, he got stuck on this part." "What's this part?" Cal asked, standing too. Taking a deep breath, Sophie answered, "Here is where the hopeless land. A journey always begins with hope. One hopes for something, therefore one seeks out that hope." Cal recalled the gates where Sophie read the words, "Abandon hope." It seemed a sad irony that the entrance would tell people to give up hope so that they could trap themselves right inside with hopelessness. Why was Dante hopeless? He questioned instead. Sophie began walking and Cal followed. Around him, he saw normal-looking people doing normal-looking things. Sophie even waved at a few while they walked. Dante confused what he saw. He thought he was seeing what the punishment was, instead of what he himself needed. I've been told what pushed him away from God was his arrogance. At death, he held his idea that belief in Christ was a way out of hell. Her last words hit Cal like a brick. "It's not?" In a way, it felt good because he shifted between Christian, atheist, Jew like they were menu items. Sophie stopped and briefly pierced her lips before answering. "Christ said, 'Follow me,' and then came here. What do you think?" She began walking again. Realizing she had continued, Cal followed. He had no idea what to think. It sounded like she was saying that Christ was the way out of hell. What she said sounded more like a riddle than an answer. How was Dante hopeless? Sophie checked her watch. Absently, she responded, "Once he realized he was in hell, he sadly abandoned his hope in Christ. It left him stuck here for a very long time." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "So I heard." Cal's attention shifted because in the distance he saw his family home. He began running to it. "Wait!" Sophie yelled behind him. "What do you see?" Not stopping until he was at the doorstep, he touched the wrought iron posts. They were painted green, and he could see the layers of paint underneath because neither he nor his dad cared to sand them before repainting them. He looked down at the small cement porch. There was a welcome mat in front of the door, but he also knew he'd find a painted one right underneath it. And the door, he touched the place right over the handle. They had replaced it years ago, and a small piece of the shape of the old handle could still be seen if you knew where to look. Still, with all these proofs, everything felt wrong. Stopping beside him, Sophie asked again, "What do you see? Whatever it is not what I see." "My childhood home. Why would this be in hell?" Not waiting for an answer, Cal knocked on the door. Cal's working theory, if this wasn't a dream, was this was where his dad ended up. He was an amazing man, a pillar of society, but agnostic. If he was here, he was in this house. Sophie craned her head to try to get eye contact. "You won't like this. Please, let's leave." The door opened and Cal saw his dad, arms wide, ready for a hug. "What are you doing here? I didn't think you would be in a place like this for decades." Walking into the hug, Cal answered, "I'm just glad to see you, Dad." But he wasn't glad. The weight of the place suddenly felt heavier. "Come in," his father said. "Let's catch up." Sophie slid on in and collapsed on the sofa that was identical to the childhood sofa, not the one that sat in the house right before his mom just moved out. She groaned, looking up at the ceiling. "We'll never get through this in time if you're going to try out all the levels." Cal didn't care. He was in awe of the detail. There were things he'd completely forgotten about, like the water ring on top of the coffee table. He had done that in the early morning when he wanted to watch He-Man, and he'd taken his breakfast into the living room. He actually smiled at the ugly macrame owl hanging on the wall. He hated it then, but he loved it now. There were even those ugly side tables he was glad to see go. Now they held a sense of charm. Running his finger along the wood grain added a small weight. Then Dad, who had briefly walked out, came back with a tray of milk and cookies. "Tell me what you've been up to." Cal took a cookie, feeling like he was 5 again. The weight increased. "I took over the shop completely. Mom moved into a smaller place. I think she's happier knowing if a toilet breaks, she doesn't have to fix it. What about you? Are you happy here?" Looking around quizzically for a moment, he then shook his head. "No one's happy here, Cal. It's hell." Then he shrugged. "But if I'm going to be somewhere on this side, it might as well be here." Cal could feel he was knitting his own eyebrows. Sophie moved to the edge of the couch. "Tell whoever is here with you goodbye. We need to move on." Still ignoring Sophie, Cal lamented, "This isn't fair. You don't deserve to be here, Dad." Slowly sighing, Sophie stood. "You find comfort in your dad, so you see your dad, but you don't feel settled in that comfort, do you, Cal?" "No," Cal said, finally acknowledging Sophie. "This isn't right." "Because this belief isn't right, it's comforting, but wrong. That," she pointed somehow in the right direction, but not to Cal's father, "is not your father. Your dad is not here with you." Sophie stepped towards the door. "That's not comforting at all," Cal cried. "That's the point," Sophie bluntly said. "You can have comfort and be hopeless, but hope is born in discomfort. I'm guessing that you don't want this to be the eternal home of your father, so it unsettles you, because he brought you comfort. Trust that God is bigger than what you see here. Meanwhile, Cal's father just casually sitting and watching. It was not only like he hadn't heard Sophie, it was like their conversation hadn't happened at all. Seeing him like this, Cal asked, "What do you think?" "About what?" he asked. "About what she said," Cal answered, affronted. "Who's she?" he lightly questioned. Cal realized he couldn't remember her name. He knew she told him. She knew his name. He had heard her just say it. Still, was his dad being dense? "She's right there. I've been talking to her." Whether or not she was there, Cal's father wouldn't even change his emotional state to discuss the possibility she was there. "You're not really my father," he tried out, but was broken by the feeling that he could feel he had spoken a truth. "Where the hell are you?" he asked himself. Everything faded to a white mist, including the oppressive feeling. He hadn't realized how heavy it had become until that moment where the feeling was gone. Sophie nodded her head. "You realize something else with that statement to let you go of that comfort, but I won't ask. That's your secret to keep." Motioning with her head, the two began to walk. Cal, as they continued, considered what Sophie was saying. His father had a temper, especially when someone was confusing him. His father would never want to admit he didn't understand, so he argued. Cal's father wasn't some sinless saint of the community. That's why it couldn't have been him. But this was a dream. It had to be. Now, that was his only theory. Of course it wasn't him. Sophie stopped. "What do you see?" Cal looked out. The white mist faded into inky blackness. "It's just darkness." "So, is your greatest fear not being able to see, or what could be in the darkness?" Sophie mused. "What?" He looked at the darkness with new eyes. If she hadn't said anything, he wouldn't have thought twice about the blackness. Now he did wonder what was beyond, or wasn't beyond. It must be the fear of nothing. That's a big one. You're afraid there's nothing beyond death. Sophie, satisfied with her answer, turned to see Cal, and her face filled with shock. "Oh, I'm sorry. I guess that's it." Cal was terrified, and it wasn't helping that Sophie was being so calm about it all. He didn't like to imagine what was beyond life. When he was a child, they'd come home from an event, and it would be dark, and there would be places where it appeared the light couldn't touch. He'd imagined driving into the deep darkness, and all three of them, Dad, Mom, and him, falling apart into nothingness. He remembered seeing a skit of Jim Carrey on a starship, and as a joke, he was sucked out an airlock. Only Cal didn't laugh from that moment, Only Cal didn't laugh. From that moment, the universe and its infinite nothingness would cause his brain to spiral into complete terror. He did not linger on the idea of what was beyond life. He'd often find something to do when his brain wandered to the inky blackness that lurked beyond. "Can we just change the subject?" "No," Sophie woefully answered. "Part of this level is giving up your comfort and accepting a new hope. You've done only half of that. By the way, you might have been stuck in that place for months or years if I wasn't there. You're not supposed to have a soul catcher walking through this with you. For that matter, you're not supposed to be a breather either." She looked into the nothingness. "I don't see darkness. I see what's really there." "What do you see?" Cal asked, swallowing hard right after he asked it. He wanted something to fill the void. Something, she softly answered, holding out her hand. Take on the hope that this isn't the end, but only the beginning. Cal could feel his heart beating in his throat. He then realized he had stopped breathing. Letting his breath out, he took some controlled, if not forced, breaths. In his head, he repeated the mantra, "This is a dream. This is a dream. This is a nightmare." He shook the mantra away. Then he fearfully nodded. Taking her hand, they stepped into the nothing.